Hello, STEM Sharks. We're going to talk today about how to write a reading response when the focus is conflict in a story. A few things that you're going to want to make sure you have ready before you begin is, first of all, have the right document, obviously, up here where you've changed the name and you have the title of the book that you are reading with the author. Correct the date, month, and year so that it reflects whatever today's date is. And then you also will probably want to have some sort of resource to help you remember what the 6 types of conflicts are that we've been working with. So one of the resources you can use is this sheet that has notes and definitions about the different types of conflict. It also has some sentence starters to help you get your thinking going and get ready to write about what you're noticing. There's also a video that we've used in the past that's a lesson about the 6 types of conflicts. And in that video, I also give you some examples in popular young adult literature so that you're able to kind of see how each of those conflicts shows up in those stories. Another resource that will be helpful for you that we will talk about in a bit is this source, which is how to cite. So how to take quoted examples from your story and put them into whatever it is that you're writing in this reading response. So there's different, it takes this slide set takes you through the steps for how to quote correctly and how to get those page numbers correct, all sorts of different scenarios. So you might want to take a look at that also if you have any questions about exactly how to do that. All right, so once you've set up your reading response, then you're going to want to figure out when you take a look at your text what you actually want to write about. So for this example today, I'm going to use a chapter from the story Chains by Laurie Anderson. And this story, the protagonist is Isabel, and she is a young Black girl who is also a slave at in about 1776 here at the start of our country. And so I want to go through, it's a short chapter. I just want to kind of go through and let you know what occurs in this story. So first of all, some of the notes that I've made here, there is an internal conflict that Isabel has in this section because she's nervous about making sure that people know that she's now free, right? Her mistress, Miss Finch, has passed away, and there is a document drawn up by a lawyer where she and her little sister Ruth were supposed to be given their freedom once Miss Finch dies. So she is a little bit nervous to ask about it, but she's really certain that, like, okay, I'm free now. And then we have her come up against her fate here, because when she starts to say that she wants to be free, that she is free, we have Pastor Weeks, who is confused, and Mr. Robert. Now, Mr. Robert is Miss Finch's nephew, and he's kind of come home to take care of her things after the funeral. And so he starts to call her a liar and says that she doesn't know how to read, that Isabel doesn't know what she's talking about. He's very rude to her and big fat jerk face, actually. So he insists in this section that because he's the nephew of Miss Finch, that all of her property becomes his property. And so he says that Isabel and Ruth belong to him now and that they are not actually free. When she tries to explain to these men, so be aware, this is a young Black girl, and she's trying to stand up to these 2 white men and say, no, I am free. Like, this is what this paper said. You just need to check with the lawyer. She's coming up against that person versus fate. To analyze this conflict, she is not internally conflicted. Pastor Weeks shows a little bit of internal conflict himself here because he he clears his throat up here, right? And he says, perhaps we should inquire about this. Maybe there is a paper. He's shot down immediately by Mr. Robert, who says that that Isabel's lying. And so Isabel doesn't have any internal conflict about this. This is a conflict of her going up against her fate, that here are these 2 white men insisting that she is still property. And so she knows she's right, but she's being overwhelmed by them and put in her place, so to speak, according to them at least. And so she feels really helpless and frustrated. And by the end of this, she is remembering in this section at the end here, she's remembering her father who fought back when they were being sold at a slave market. And he acted like a lion. And then in this last part here, she tries to open her mouth to roar, but not a single sound escaped. And so she's a young girl and she's helpless, right? So when I was thinking about the type of conflict that I wanted to analyze for this story or for this reading response, I thought about doing the person versus person, like when Isabel is going against Mr. Roberts and there's this conflict there where he calls her a liar. But I felt like that was a little too obvious. It would be an easy enough conflict to write about. I thought about writing about some of this internal conflict. And let me be clear, it would be an easy conflict to write about because it's a very clearly identified conflict. There is also this conflict here where she's really nervous. She believes that she's going to be free. You know, she's trying to be to stand up at proper and act in a respectful way with these two white men. But she's really confident about, hey, I'm going to be free now. And so she, that there's a little bit of internal conflict there about her being worried and anxious. Again, I wasn't sure if that would be enough, if I had enough to say about that. I wondered also about writing about the internal conflict that it seems that Pastor Weeks feels here, and then how he switches to tell her, oh, well, remember your place. And, like he's not willing to stand up to Mr. Robert, which makes him a giant coward in my book. But I feel strongly about that conflict. I just don't know if I have enough to say about it. So what I decided in the end is to write about these passages that are in green here, where it's more about Isabel and her fate and the helplessness she feels when she's caught in her fate. And so one of the important things to note when you're identifying a person versus fate conflict is that helplessness, that it's out of their hands. They can't fight against it. It's happening out of their control. And so it's just this kind of fate to happen. So once I decided which conflict I was going to focus on, then I set myself up here. So again, if you wanted to read specifically, like word for word, that story so that you understood this analysis better, you can go ahead and click that link right there. That'll take you right to this copy of the story. But I'm going to get right into what I wrote about, right? Like how I wrote my reading response. So the first thing I did was identify the conflict that I do want to write about. And so after thinking about all those conflicts, I settled on that person versus fate. So I clearly state in my topic sentence of my paragraph, I state the title of the book. So in the book Chains, there is a tragic example of a person versus fate. Here we go. A tragic example of a person versus fate conflict when Isabel is not given her freedom from slavery. So again, I'm stating the title of the book here. I state what type of conflict it is, person versus fate, and I tell you who it's between, like who exactly is the person, what is the fate, right? And that will help me make sure that I am following our formula here. So I identified the type of conflict and I stated my thinking about it, that it's a really sad and tragic conflict, and it's specifically the type of conflict of person versus fate. So step 2, I need to explain what's going on in the book. So the context or circumstances that are making me think that it's that type of conflict. So in my words, I'm retelling that section of the story. So here we go. After her mistress, Miss Finch, dies, there is a document from a lawyer that says Isabel and her little sister should be given their freedom. When she tells Pastor Weeks that she needs help in figuring out how to get a job and where to live, he is confused. Isabel tries to explain, but Mr. Robert calls her a liar and insists that because he is Miss Finch's nephew, he'll be selling both Isabel and her little sister Ruth. Isabel then realizes that Pastor Weeks will not stand up to Mr. Robert and that Mr. Robert has all the power over her as a white man. So that's me summarizing that part of the story. The next thing I want to do, though, is introduce my quote that's going to support that this is all, she's feeling like this is all out of her hands and there's nothing she can do to fight back. She's trying to tell them, no, you're wrong, right? I do have my freedom if you would just ask the lawyer. But she's powerless against these guys, right? So the impact on her, and that's what I want to quote. So when I took a look through here, what I want to quote is this part right here about how she's realizing here that this is just spinning out of her control and she's not going to get what she is owed. And so her insides went cold, like I swallowed water straight from a deep, dark well. This couldn't be happening. So those were the two lines that I thought were the most important and the best lines for supporting this idea that things are spinning out of her control. So I want to bring it into my writing, and I introduce it with she thinks to herself. I have a comma here. My insides went cold, right? So the quotation marks, my insides went cold like I'd swallowed water straight from a deep, dark well. This couldn't be happening. You'll see I have my quote there again, and then a space. And in parentheses, I put the last name of the author, Anderson. There's just a space, no comma or anything, just a space, and the page number that it's found on, which is page 10. So again, I am quoting it. I'm taking it exactly as it is here. Capital letters, punctuation, everything is exactly how it is in the story. I put quotes around it, and then it's on page 10 here. So I want to make sure that I have all that correct. Afterwards, then, the next step. So after I quote my evidence, or after I bring in my evidence in a quote, now I need to explain how that quote supports my thinking. And so I will come in here and say the description of her going cold with the image of a deep and dark well create feelings of hopelessness against her fate of being a slave. And so I'm trying to purposely use my wording here to tie it to the type of conflict as person versus fate, right? So this description, it's like she's drowning, right? Like it's this cold water, right in a deep, dark well. It can't be happening. She doesn't believe it. She feels powerless and hopeless, or at least is starting to feel hopeless, right? Against this fate. So the next part here, this is going to be if you are a student who is going to challenge yourself to find two quotes to support your thinking. So if I just have this one quote, I could include in my last part of my paragraph. So after I've got my evidence, I explain why that evidence supports my thinking about the person versus fate conflict. The last thing I want to do in this paragraph is explain why it matters that I'm noticing this. And so some of the strategies I can think about to do that is I want to reflect on why this is important in the story. So I might think about what is it helping me understand better? I might think about how does it connect to other events and characters in the book? And I might think about how could I use it to predict how I think this will impact later events. And so because I'm only on page 10, it's helping me understand the character overall. It's helping me understand Isabel and all of the different conflicts that she's going to have to go up against in this story because it's just the beginning. I don't know enough in the reading yet to really talk about how it's connected to other events or characters. What I can do, though, for sure, is predict how I think it's going to impact later events. And so because I'm so early in the book, I chose that path. So I wrote, she was nervous in the beginning of this chapter to ask for help, but she believed that she would get her freedom because her mother and Miss Finch told her so. Although this is not her fault, I wonder if Isabel will feel like she failed to protect Ruth. It will be telling in the next chapters whether Isabel gives up and becomes depressed about her fate, or if instead she refuses to give up and she continues to fight for herself and Ruth to have the freedom that they deserve. Now, if I'm going to predict what I think will happen, I think that she'll fight for herself and for Ruth to get their freedom. I just don't know if she's going to be very successful at it in this time period. That was a hard battle. That's almost 100 years before the Civil War, even. She doesn't have good odds, right, of being able to fight to get her freedom. What I want to show you is if you are going to try to bring in a second quote to support your thinking, what does that look like, right? So if we go back up here where I'm explaining, this feeling of her being hopeless against her fate, I can then jump back into the story, right? So if this is where this quote comes from, I want to jump back in and maybe summarize some of these other details. And this is the second quote that I want to use, right? So it's about when she tries, she opens her mouth wanting to roar and fight for her freedom, but she's just silent, right? She's too scared and feeling too powerless. And that has to do with her father up in this part. She's remembering how he fought like a lion to keep his family together and failed in his mission. He was beaten and the family was separated and sold to different people. So what I did is I summarized that, right? I'm retelling that part of the story so that it makes sense to someone reading my paragraph. So I say, Isabel begins to cry, and she begs Pastor Weeks to find the lawyer, but he ignores her. What a jerk. She remembers being younger and her father fighting like a lion at a slave market to keep them together. He was beaten, and his family suffered the fate of being split up and sold. So then I'm going to introduce my second quote here. As Isabel realizes that might happen to her and Ruth, she thinks, I opened my mouth to roar, but not a sound escaped. I could not even mewl like a kitten. And so again, that's word for word from my quote here, or excuse me, it's word for word from the text. And then it's on page 12 here. And I want to make sure that I've quoted it correctly. I just put 12 in the parentheses here because I've already stated the author's last name. So once you do that one time in your writing, as long as the whole paragraph is about the same, using the same author, then you don't have to write Anderson again, right? Now I want to explain how that quote connects to my thinking and how it's supporting this conflict. The fact that she is not a lion like her father emphasizes how powerless she is against these two white men, deciding her fate and denying her freedom. And so then I can jump into my thinking about predicting how this conflict will impact the rest of the story, right? So either way, it works, right? That I can, I can take it out. This part here, right? I can take that second quote out and the explanation and just wrap it up. Or I can push myself, and it doesn't take much, right? Just a couple more sentences, and I can drop in a second quote to support my thinking with the explanation right after it. All right? So there you go. Make sure that you're asking for help when you need it. Make sure you're using the resources that you have in order to help you think deeply about whatever it is that you're reading.